Watch with wonder as I take this simple, flat circle, this mere shape, and I turn it into a three-dimensional sphere. Alakazam! Blammo! Shammo! Snapadoo! Frou-frou! Voila! Okay, now let me guide you step by step on how I did that. Okay, so what I'm starting with is a basic circle, and I just took an object and I traced it. Also took a ruler, made a line behind it as if the circle is sitting on some kind of surface. And then I have already indicated that there's going to be an area where there's a cast shadow. And so that's just an oval. It's kind of sitting underneath of the circle, and it's elongated. That shows us basically where the light source should be, the position of this cast shadow. The light source is going to be somewhere up here, coming down from that direction. And what we can imagine is that there's going to be levels of shading. We have to kind of imagine the light coming down and striking this ball, this round sphere, and it's going to be shining brightest in an area that looks a little bit like that. And then, as we move away from this oval, this light spot, we're going to have values that get slightly darker and darker until they become really dark. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm really just indicating the places where different values will kind of exist. And I'm showing how the values travel around and curve with the surface of the sphere, because the shape of your shading matters just as much as, you know, the smoothness of your shading. So it's going to be something like that. I don't actually want these lines to be visible when I'm all done, but for right now they're just kind of indicating that this is the lightest spot, then this gets a little bit darker, this gets a little bit darker, a little bit darker, a little bit darker. Okay, that's the idea. And then with the cast shadow we can do something similar, because directly underneath the ball, the sphere, it's going to be darkest. It's going to receive the least amount of light. And then you might have one or two more levels that you can indicate coming out from that. So it's sort of like they're rings, dark, medium, a little bit lighter, but they're all going to be shaded on the cast shadow, okay? As I begin shading, one of the things that I want to keep in mind also is that on this side of the sphere, even though this is going to be the shaded side of the sphere, there's something called reflected light, because light's coming down and hitting other things, and it reflects off and then off of the surface and then onto the ball. So it reflects around. And so there's could be some reflected light on the very edge of this ball. So when I'm shading this area, I may want to leave a little sliver that's a little bit lighter. Also, I'm going to switch to a more regular pencil because it's going to be much easier to shade with this pencil than it would be a mechanical pencil, because this can be worn down to a flatter edge, which allows me to do softer shading. So basically, I'm just going to begin shading this dark sliver right here, and I'm going to maintain this shape. And I'm also going to kind of pay attention to the strokes that I shade with. I can go in different directions, but mostly I kind of want to pay attention to the curviness of the ball as I shade. Okay, so it's a process that takes time, and it requires you to do multiple layers of shading. And notice that I erased the rings that I drew to illustrate the different spots where shading is going to happen. That's because I didn't want them, like I said, to be visible when I'm all done with this. And I can still basically see them. You might not be able to see them on the video, but I can see those rings and where they are. And so I'm still going to use those as a guide to show how the shading is going to fill in those shapes. When I'm shading, I typically am not going to make areas as dark as I eventually will until I've done quite a bit more shading on the other areas. I'll start shading this and I know that this is going to be the darkest area, but then I'll move out and start doing the other shading in the other areas, and then I'll come back. Shading is also about practicing controlling your pressure. So obviously the more pressure you apply to the pencil, the darker it's going to get. But you want to be able to control that. You want to be able to lift up on the pressure so that you can get lighter values and softer shading. So it's all about the amount of pressure that you're applying. One of the things I'm trying to do when I'm shading this is I'm trying to control smudges and streaks and lines, which I'm not going to be perfect at doing that. And I could improve it if I used a blending tool later on too, which is fine, but I typically don't. And so what I do when I see those streaks and smudges starting to form, I kind of carefully shade around them so that I can make the area around them a little bit more consistent. And so it's also just making sure that you're paying attention to where you're putting shading. Sometimes you can move in a circular motion if that feels right. Sometimes, a lot of times, you're going to follow the curviness of the ball. But then also just moving in multiple directions softly can get rid of the appearance of lines and streaks and blotches. And I typically find it more difficult to shade lighter values than it is darker values. Darker values I don't have to be as light with my pressure, and I don't think that the smudges and streaks are as visible. But then with the lighter values, it becomes harder because mistakes become much more visible. So take your time. Try to add a nice soft base layer to areas, and then you can go back and try to blend it in. One of the mistakes that I see a lot that I wish students would stop doing is they want to do a shortcut, and they want to do a very little amount of shading with the pencil, and then they immediately want to go to some kind of blending tool like their finger or a blending stump. But the thing is that usually they haven't shaded enough with the pencil yet. There isn't actually enough pencil on the paper yet to work with the shading, and then so they're just smudging around just a tiny bit of shading, and it doesn't really look good in most cases. So you got to do the work with the shading first with the pencil, and then you can decide whether you want to use a blending tool or not. But again, I typically don't use a blending tool. That's just a personal preference. I like the look of the pencil, and I don't like the ultra blended look where it's like super smooth, like it's dusted on there. I don't particularly like that as much, but that's, again, like I said, just a personal preference. I can make it smooth with just the pencil, relatively smooth, and it can look like I did it with a pencil, I have a tendency in these videos to want to rush so that it doesn't take quite as long. But you shouldn't. You shouldn't rush. You should try to be patient with the process, build it up at the pace that you need to in order to make it look smooth and well, like the transition between values looks smooth from dark to light. And so when I get up here, I'm mostly not touching this area, but I also don't want it to look like a hard-edged oval. I don't want there to be an outline here, because there wouldn't be on a normal highlight. I want it to look like it's faded into the shading, faded, which again requires an extremely soft touch. And it might mean that you have to go back in there with your eraser and just gently pull out some of the shading. And you don't even have to, you can just kind of press down your eraser and it'll pull out a little bit of it. I'm going to go back now, like I said I was, and I'm going to go back to this area to boost the darkness level a little bit. One of the things that we all can work on is value contrast, and I talk about value contrast a lot in different situations because it's one of the things that people struggle with a lot, is making things dark enough, having a strong difference between darks and lights. It's really great when you can start to achieve better value contrast, because things really start to pop and look more three-dimensional and stand out. And value contrast is just one of the ways that creates a lot more interest when you're looking at the drawing. Okay, so I think I'm going to say that I'm mostly done with shading the actual sphere. I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. So try to notice how the shape of the shading kind of follows along with the rings that I had placed on the sphere. Okay, the shape. You kind of have these crescent moon shapes to the shading rings, okay? Also, I want to draw your attention to this little sliver of light spot on the edge, on the back edge, where you would think it would be dark, and that's the reflected light that I was talking about, where it just gets a little bit lighter again because of reflections that happen. And of course that depends on the type of surface and the lighting situation that's happening, but that's something that does happen, okay? And now I'm going to shade the cast shadow, still according to this light source. And that's just going to really help this sphere look like it is solidly placed in an actual 3D environment. It gives us a sense of space in this situation even more, okay? So I'm going to start with dark, then medium, then light, but all of it's going to be shaded. And I'm going to erase those rings so that I can just barely see them. Okay, there you go. That's me turning a simple flat circle, a shape, which is one of the art elements, and turning it into a three-dimensional sphere, which is a form, which is also one of the art elements, using line and value, which is through shading and shadow and highlights. And there's also a light source, which helps us to know where to place the shading. Thanks for watching.